First, I'm going to open up my fabric. Then I'm going to meet both sides of the salvage edges towards the middle of that fabric, like this. I'm doing this because I want to paste both my pattern pieces down on each edge so that I am cutting them on the fold on both sides. Once I do that, I'm going to add my seam allowance, which for me is 1/2 inch. I'm going to do that on both sides of my patterns. Then I'm going to mark my notches, and I'm also going to mark where my darts are. After I do that, I am going to actually mark my corners for each corner I'm going to sew so that I can line them up before I sew instead of lining up my seam allowance, because then it might throw your pattern piece off a little bit. I'm going to sew all my darts closed by making sure my pins are going through both of the lines that I have marked. Then I'm going to sew my darts. You want to sew them going from the edge of your piece towards the point, opposite of what I like to do, which is go from the point towards my edge. You want to backstitch on the edge, but not at the point. You want to leave a long thread at the point so that you can tie a knot about 3 to 4 times to secure it. Once you do that, you want to iron all of your darts. Your front darts should be ironed facing downwards, and your shoulder darts in the back should be ironed facing the shoulder seams. Now you want to sew the shoulders together with right sides facing. You want to make sure you're pinning it where your pattern pieces meet at that corner, not where your seam allowance meets, because it might be off depending on your seam allowance measurements or how you do your seam allowance. So that's why you want to add the corners when you add your seam allowance, like I have it here. Once you sew the shoulder seams, you want to repeat all the steps to your lining fabric. When you have that lining fabric all sewn, you want to pin your lining to your main fabric with right sides facing each other, and you want to pin around the neck hole. You want to sew around the neck hole, and when you sew the corners, you want to leave the needle down, pick up the presser foot, and pivot the fabric so you get a nice clean corner, and also around the V point in the front shirt, at the front of the shirt. Now you want to cut as close to the point on the V shape, but not through the stitch line, to get a crisp point. You want to trim and snip into the neckline. You also want to trim your corners. By cutting into the neckline, it allows the fabric to lay nicer once it is turned right sides together and being pressed down. When you turn right sides together, you want to iron and add a top stitch to that neckline. My top stitch is 1/8 of an inch, but you should get as close to your edge as you feel comfortable with. and you do your top stitch. By using the burrito method, we're going to roll half of the shirt towards the other armhole. As you can see me doing here, you want to sandwich the rolled edge within the lining and the main fabric like this. Then you want to sew that armhole. You want to trim and snip into the armhole edge like you did with the neckline, and then you want to pull the rolled edge out, turning the shirt right sides out. You want to iron and top stitch that armhole. You want to leave about 1 inch without that top stitch on each side of the armhole so that you can sew down the side seams nicely. You want to repeat the burrito method to the other armhole, iron and top stitch that as well. Open the shirt by lining front and back sides of the main and lining fabric together. It should be right sides together. You want to sew the side seams together on both sides. You want to leave about 2 inches of an opening on one side of the lining. You want to pin one seam at the hem of your shirt when it is right sides together, so that when you pull it through the 2-inch hole, the shirt will be inside out, but you will know which corners go together. So when you do that, you want to pin the rest of the hem and then sew it. Once you finish sewing everything up, you want to pull the fabric back through that 2-inch hole, pulling it right sides back out. You want to iron the hem and top stitch. Lastly, you would want to either top stitch the 2-inch hole closed or hand stitch it closed. Thank you for watching. I hope you love your shirt as much as I do. There is a link to the pattern that could be found in the description below.